This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Kevin Rigby, a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of African American Studies at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His research is concerned with the complex effects and affects of afropessimist theory for thinking through issues of history, culture, and politics, specifically focused on the structure and meaning of Black protest. In this conversation, we explore the place of pessimist theory in Black study, political mobilization and community work, and how Black studies shapes research and the classroom. Kevin, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. I was happy how easily we found time. It was an easy schedule. It's not always easy schedule. We're both recording this right at the end of our semesters, so this is also a good moment. So I've been looking forward to this, and the fact that it comes as I wrap up the final week of classes here at University of Maryland, it's making me extra happy.
Yeah, it's my first end of my first year at Illinois too, so the very end, this is the last thing, so I'm excited to be ending it this way.
Yes, let's end on positive notes rather than student complaints or bitterness as we walk out the door.
Or like ransomware attacks, apparently, on campus.
But it would really be great to have your perspective. I think as someone coming into Africana Studies, out of an Africana Studies program, this is the kind of perspective that you have is really important to have as part of the series. And so your thoughtfulness and your perspective in this moment and talking about your research and how you envision the field and all of that, it's going to be a really fantastic contribution to the series. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast.
Thanks again.
So we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about your research and hear about it and hear how you think about the field of Black studies and the relationship between the two. But I wanted to start off really with a more personal question, which is, what got you interested in Black studies? What drew you to it? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I guess it kind of begins in my teenage years. I grew up kind of in a purple family, I guess you could say, politically. Less so these days. But at the time, I was coming into consciousness at the same time that Bush was being elected for a second time, with the help of some people in my household. And at the time, I kind of identified as a young Republican and would come home every day from...
I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt you, but Leonard McKinnis at Illinois has a similar "I was a Republican" confession in his intro. So sorry to interrupt you, but
that one is...
What's going on down there at UIUC?
No. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not a Republican now.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I think we saw that coming.
I do think that it was interesting. The transformation from being in that headspace and into some of the later headspaces I have come to occupy. I do think it has something to do with it. My grandparents, both from Tennessee, moved up to Detroit somehow around the same time, met at the King speech march that happened in Detroit around the time that they moved up. They got married, started the family that I was born into. And there is a kind of way that I can look back on my childhood now and understand the kind of aspirations and politics of my family in the kind of aftermath of the hope of something like a civil rights movement in a Black city like Detroit. That being said, it also accompanied a lot of, respectability, a lot of uninterrogated nationalist propaganda and American exceptionalism, all of these things. And so when I was 16 in high school, my mom said, okay, you're 16, it's the time you should get a job. But she gave me advice to say, if you can avoid it, don't get a retail or food service job, which was kind of some of the best advice she could have given me, I think, at the time, because now I started looking for other things, and before then I hadn't been considering kinds of work generally. But at the time, I found a paid internship program with a nonprofit called the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion. It was a 14-month paid internship program for young people to introduce them to, youth justice, social justice, community organizing, other organizing organizers, organizations, and groups of young people in the city and also the region. And so it brought folks together. The young people that were part of the internship program were both from Detroit and from the suburbs. And it was just kind of this really transformative experience that introduced me to a kind of agency in myself as a young Black person in Detroit, coming into consciousness at the time where there's so much negativity about what Detroit is, what the young people of Detroit are doing or are capable of. And so that was a really transformative time. After that, I kept along in community organizing, also political and electoral organizing. Like when Rashida Tlaib was running for state representative, I volunteered on that campaign. Before John Conyers kind of died in disgrace, I guess you could say, I was interning in his office. And so I got really into community organizing and electoral organizing. And around 2012, 2013, 2014, I also started getting involved then in the kind of burgeoning movement for Black Lives. I went to a convening that the movement had in I think it was Columbus, Ohio, maybe Columbus State University or Cleveland State University is what it was. And there I met Charlene Carruthers, who was the national director of the Black Youth Project 100 at the time. And we hit it off. I was there with a friend of mine at the time, and we were like, yo, we want to bring this to Detroit. What can we do? A few months later, there's a chapter in Detroit. And so we're getting that off the ground, getting young people and Black organizing in the city broadly back on the ground, because our organization got started, but around the same time, a few others got started and just collaborating around that whole thing. And I had majored in African American studies in undergrad at that point, because coming in from community organizing, thinking about power, race, politics, justice, were things that I was already interested in and seemed like I could continue doing in the field of African American studies. And so the whole time I was in law school, in undergrad, the plan was to go to law school at the end. And when I got to the end, my last semester, I remember telling my best friend on his porch before I went back, before the semester started again, yo, I think I want to get a PhD instead. But at the time, I had no idea how to be competitive to do that, because I had spent all of my undergrad time preparing to go to law school. The motivating factor that made me turn from law to graduate school was just that I felt through organizing, through community organizing, political organizing, electoral organizing, and just the kind of zeitgeist of Black Lives Matter as it was existing at that time, I still felt that there were things about anti-Blackness as a feature of political life that I did not have the space to fully understand within the time scale of a campaign or of an election cycle. And so I wanted more space to be able to think about that. And I was introduced to critical work in African American studies, actually not in the classroom. I was introduced to the work by folks like Saidiya Hartman, Frank Wilderson, Jerry Sexton, Calvin Warren, via Tumblr, actually. And I didn't really understand at that point what that critical trend in the field that was emerging was and who these people were. I just saw them taking anti-Blackness seriously, taking violence seriously, taking some of the contradictions and impasses of coalition, solidarity, and politics more broadly that I had experienced when I was doing organizing, right, quite seriously. And that was really compelling to me. At the same time, it was theory, and I was like, "Oh, I guess you can just kind of say whatever you want if it's smart enough," you know? I had no understanding of what theory actually was still at
Mhm,
that point.
mhm.
Once I finally was introduced to the kind of moniker many of those authors are known under, afropessimism was again not in the classroom, but at the Allied Media Conference in Detroit, which is a media conference, obviously, but it was a kinda exercise, like a move around the room kind of exercise that was facilitated by Savannah Shange and Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And they were I don't remember what the, actual exercise was, but it was trying to point out some of the kind of, like, um, sticking points, around anti-Blackness that persist even in kind of like liberal or multicultural political spaces. And I found that to be really moving and really helpful for just thinking about a lot of the things that had driven me to think about getting a PhD. So still at this point though, I'm not prepared. No PhD program worth its snuff would have admitted me at this point. And so I was actually at a Greenpeace Direct Action training camp in Tampa Bay, Florida, waiting to hear back for like a last round interview for a policy job in DC when I found out that I was accepted to this postbac program at Yale, which I had found less than a week before then by going to the second page of a Google search result and finding this
Huh,
page on Yale's website that looked totally
amazing.
fake at the time. And it was because the year I was going into it was the first year that they had included folks in the social sciences and humanities in this kind of post-bac structure at
Huh.
Yale. And so I got in when I was at Florida, and I was like, when I was in Florida, I was like, okay, well, here we go. So, you know, I'm from Detroit. No one in my family is or are academics, and I knew very little about what academia was. And so all I knew is that Yale was giving me $30,000 to go be there for a year to
Alright.
figure out how to get into grad school, you know?
Mhm.
And it was a great time. So that was like my second African American Studies department there at Yale. And I was there for a year. I'd never really figured out what it was I was supposed to do. I took like maybe one or two classes. But the funny thing is, at the end, um, I had only written like, you know, a 26-page seminar paper that I had used as a writing sample to apply to grad schools. And the one other humanist there had written like a 100-page thesis thing. I don't know exactly what it was, but in the end, we both still got into Berkeley. And so
Hey.
I was like, whatever it was, I think, you know, I figured it out. And so then I get to Berkeley, and that is again transformative just because being from Detroit, seeing a place with elevation, realizing in January that, you know, most of my life had been affected by like seasonal depression, you know, that was that was transformative. And I would say that my time at Berkeley really happened on like three different levels, I guess you could say. Because there was that one level of, whoa, I'm finally in California. I used to dream about this kind of situation, which is just a completely different world than the one that I was in. Second was the uh like just the time and space of the program. Um I was brought in without guaranteed fellowship funding at the time. They're like, "You can still come, but you're just gonna have to teach from, like, your first day here." And I was
Mhm,
like,
mhm.
"Okay, that's fine." In the end, I still got, you know, several fellowships while I was there, but I came in and I was teaching, and that really ended up helping me because the grad students there are a part of a union, and we went on a strike 3 times, and so by the time I made it toward the end of my grad school period, time I was making a good amount of money finally from being a TA, which was a nice time to be. Third kind of way that I went through Berkeley, of course, was the intellectual part, which was, I mean, quite difficult, I guess, as PhD programs tend to be because, yeah, I mean, being a PhD student just kind of sucks at times. But in also real ways, like I went through, um, I worked with three different advisors before the one that I ended up graduating with. And that was in part to bring it back to the kind of way that I encountered the work that uh, really compelled me before I got into the academy, like so-called Afro-pessimist work. It was that, the kind of reticence and resistance that characterizes many members of the field's relationship or opinion of Afro-pessimism. At the time, though, because at the end of grad school, or at the end of undergrad, I started getting connected with folks who are brilliant and who have, been fighting this kind of uphill battle long before me. Um, and so by the time I finally got to Berkeley, I was uh, a little battle tested in it. I
Mhm.
remember the very first American Studies conference I went to. It was before I started grad school. I was just getting in, eyes big, yada yada yada, and I was at some um, talk, and the people were giving their talks. None of them mentioned Afro pessimism. I think maybe one mentioned Sadia Hartman or something like that. Again, not even in this vein, but a very senior professor in this ASA meeting got up during the Q&A, like stood up and went on this like huge kind of tirade against Afro-pessimism and like what it was doing to the field and in Black studies, all of this stuff. And I was just like, whoa, like what is going on? But fortunately, before I got into any of this, I experienced that and had the wisdom of folks who came before me. So that was really helpful. And there were obviously dark times in the PhD, not in any like crazy way, but just like, oh, maybe I should do something else. In the end, though, my committee, my advisor Eula Taylor, Patrice Douglas, when she arrived at Berkeley, were godsends in terms of like getting me the kind of space and support I needed to do the work that I was trying to do,
Mhm.
and also a kind of willingness to engage the thoughts that I'm putting on the page and giving to you versus the kind of boogeyman aspect that some people can kind of relate to Afro pessimism with. Any whiff
Mhm.
of it can oftentimes send them running for the hills. And so I really appreciated that, and I don't take that for granted at a time when many grad students who are interested in some of the same kind of thinkers or areas of work are having much more difficult times trying to get through their program because of the difficulty to receive support that they experience sometimes from senior professors who I guess just kind of don't vibe with it. But yeah, I can't sing my advisor's praises enough because, no one would say that, Dr. Taylor is an Afro pessimist, but she read every single page of every chapter that I wrote multiple times and sat with me and asked me questions and pushed me. And I think made me a better writer and a better thinker
Mhm.
overall. And so I think that that is also the point of what we should be doing here is like pushing each other, testing each other, but also giving each other space and supporting each other to
Mhm.
do the kind of work that we're supposed to be doing, which is not necessarily always to be right, but to, push and stretch and challenge the kind of bounds of what we think we know and how we know it. And so in that sense, in the end, I'm not sure there's any other place that I could have completed my PhD um, other than Berkeley, both because it's a standalone PhD program, and it has, a strong identity of both being a small department, but also being a place where kind of wide array of interests can be supported and
Mhm.
propelled by the kind of like larger Berkeley machine. And certainly, there are many professors in other departments and many grad students in other departments who helped me through that. but also everybody that I loved and cared about and thought was so cool and doing the hottest, coolest work at the time I was entering grad school came from Berkeley. You know what I'm saying?
Ah,
Not even just the
that's
AFM
great.
department, but just kind of I always joke with my friends that Black studies since 2000 or 1997, if you wanna go there, has been the story of Berkeley, but that's just me being a little, like, rah-rah about it.
That's okay to be a fan of the program.
Yeah.
It's funny, I do have to mention that, so many of the names you mentioned have been on the podcast: Eula Taylor, Patrice
Mhm.
Douglas, Charlene Carruthers,
Mhm.
um, there were a couple other people, just forgetting right now. So it was Alexis Pauline Gumbs as well.
Mhm.
So it's great to see these names having this presence and across your journey into Black studies, also on the podcast. Um, and so it's interesting to me to hear also about this formation of Black studies, both inside and outside the classroom, right? And how the outside the classroom sort of connected you to Black studies, but also put you back in the classroom and in a particular way. But also, it sounds like also created a sort of imperative to go there, rather than just a choice like law school or PhD. I mean, as you said, it was like I need to do a PhD, not this is one option among many. And I'm curious, I'm curious to hear you talk about this next question because of all the time you spent in Black Studies as an undergrad and grad student and now postdoc. And I want to hear you talk about your portrait of the field.
Mhm.
And I ask this question always in terms of the origins
Mhm.
of Black studies, which had a tension at the heart of its founding, which was first this demand by students that universities have a place to study Black life,
Mhm.
right? To study Black literature, sociology, history, art, etc. And so that demand for a space where the intellectual tradition could be studied and developed, that's one of the origins of Black studies, is the establishment of Black studies departments that play that function. But of course, this is happening at the exact same moment that the radicalization of Black liberation struggle has blurred so many of those boundaries between, or at least contested those boundaries between campuses and communities, between ideas and action, between classrooms and political mobilization. And I think we inherit that in Black studies today in the political demands of the field, right? That it demands a certain kind of political commitment, but also a demand to study the intellectual tradition. And sort of in that context, I'm interested to hear how you think about the field of Black studies. What's that portrait
Yeah.
that orients and grounds you?
Okay, I'll start with the first one. I think that there are multiple Black studies in a few senses. I think that there are, non-negligible differences between Pan-African studies, Africology, African diaspora, Africana, African American, and Black studies, right? Those are kind of orientations. Um, and I also think that disproportionately, those orientations are decided based on one's um, priorities or relationships to this question that you're asking about the relationship between protest and study. Uh, I can say that, for me, I did not know what Black Studies was as an undergrad. There were a few people, I think maybe one or two people in my department, Lisa Zay Winters, who was also on this podcast. Lisa Zay Winters was really important for me thinking about going to grad school. She wrote my letters for Yale, all that kind of stuff. So I knew that there was kind of like a higher order of thinking going on in Black studies. But at Wayne State, which is, still R1, but kind of like a community-based campus with, higher non-traditional populations of students, I think at places like that, even though that is an African American studies department, that there can tend to be a more community focus on what the work of the department is and
Mhm.
its relationship to those outside of it. And I
Uh-huh.
also think that we see that more in Pan-African and Africologist departments, less so sometimes than Africana, African American, African diaspora. Africana, Both Africana and I'll just say it at one time. I think Africana is an umbrella term that is, I don't really know because African diaspora studies seems like it could be related to this kind of Africana, although I know that Africana comes from a kind of, I don't know, Atlantic uh, designation. And so I think you also see Africana more in smaller liberal arts colleges, particularly those on the East Coast. And interestingly enough, I was also talking to my students about this the other day because they don't think about the geography of Black studies, but I also think that that has something to do with what Black studies look like and where as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, like in the Northeast kind of corridor where you have, New York and all the Ivies, I think that Black studies is disproportionately invested in art practice, and kind of like cultural transmissions. Whereas, of course, in the Midwest, I think barring kind of like Northwestern as a private university that has, at least in recent years, I think been really big on Black feminist theory, performance theory. I think that there's a lot of organizing, labor activism, history situations going on. I'm thinking about Wayne State. I'm thinking about Illinois to some extent. Although the revamping of Michigan State, sorry, I actually have a lot of thoughts about the minutia of where Black studies departments are actually located and why they're doing the work that they are. The revamping of Michigan State's African American Studies program and PhD in a kind of like hard, not hard line, but like, a strong focus on Black feminism, which I also think connects a lot of Black studies departments, but not all of them. In the South, more so kind of civil rights history, but I think the private schools in the South are a little different. Like you got Duke with the Black feminist thing and Nash being there now. And then once you get out west, when I got into Berkeley, my advisor at Yale, he was like, "Oh, that's great. There's just so much room for theory in the California system." And I do associate many, but not all, of the AFM departments on the West Coast with kind of theory more, I guess. Mostly just fine in Berkeley. Depending on what time you're working at Stanford, you might find some there as well. So anyway, I actually think I'm laying this all out because I think that there is like geographic and kind of epistemological and kind of just generational differences about where Black studies looks like and what it looks like. If I summed it up, I think it's fair to say that it is a preoccupation with kind of like Black history, life, and culture. Yeah, and I guess the last thing to also say is that there's kind of also an elite branch of African American studies, you know what I'm saying, which kind of crosses many of those locations in a more global sense. But that, of course, just comes down to, structure of elite reproduction in the academy already. But I think about this sometimes because I don't know. I said I don't know where else I could have completed my PhD, but I think that that is also a reflection of where you can do certain kinds of work, right? And there's a certain leeway that I had at Berkeley that I might not have had if I went to University of Louisville, for example, for my PhD. That is not just about, intellectually what you can do, but
geographically.
and a certain there's a certain estimation of who you are or the caliber of your work based on the kind of place that you're coming from, which is related to your job prospects. And if you want a job but you're coming from a less than elite school, perhaps then it is much better if your work is like, very legibly excellent. You know what I'm saying? Whereas at Berkeley, it was kind of just up in the air, like figure out something, write a dissertation. We trust that, it's going to be good. And they read it all, no one signed off on it without having read it, but there was not a push to be disciplined in a, particular way. And the last thing I'll say about what is Black studies, I think is really difficult sometimes to put a nice neat bow around, because I think boundaries of Black studies are actually quite porous because of our history and our relationship to other disciplines and the kind of, still historical recency of Black studies
Mhm,
PhDs.
mhm.
Um, and even some of our top programs are, joint PhDs, which, and even if they're not joint PhDs, many of the faculty that are in the department are trained in some traditional discipline. And if you're working with them, the idea is that you're going to be becoming an anthropologist or historian just from some kind of Black studies angle. And I think that there are very few places right now. We'll see what happens with Emory and Columbia as they come online. But I think that there are very few places right now where Black studies as such has like a strong, singular, and irreducible idea of itself that is not like, sure, you're getting a PhD here, but you need to become a performance theorist or you need to become an X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
Even though I engage across psychoanalysis, political theory, and philosophy, I don't think I would call myself any one of those in particular, right? I think of myself as a Black studies kind of broad theoretician who uses, certain sets of methodological traditions to get at the point that I'm at. And the perhaps promiscuity of my use of these various traditions stems from my own kind of understanding that all of these things didn't have Black studies in mind, as an intellectual project when they were making them. And the intellectual project and object of Black studies, I think, requires a very, you know, bold relationship to disciplinary methods and also our our unique articulation of what Black studies is. And if anything, after being in 4 departments of African American studies, I'd like to think of myself as, probably not first generation, but among the earlier generations of academics coming into the academy who could have possibly gone African American studies all the way through, right?
Yeah.
And I like to think of my work as, being a reflection of that, but also this is kind of insane, but I want to put Black studies on the offensive. You know what I'm saying? Because I feel like a lot of the issues that we're facing right now is both the humanities being devalued generally, but also the kind of like unique devaluation of African American studies because of the way it's overdetermined as like history or sociology or like a kind of knowledge that we should have already known but doesn't do anything in the world now. I'm really interested in developing theory that is a Black studies theory that comes from within Black studies that makes compelling arguments for how thinking theoretically in Black studies actually does something in the world, actually helps you see things differently, actually helps you ask different questions.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where I see my own self involved in the field more broadly. But yeah, so that was a long answer.
And so it's interesting. I think one of the most important threads across this podcast series, um, and it comes out most strongly in ways that I think ought to challenge all of us who aren't from these programs, from the legacy programs, from UMass and Temple, where a really strong and robust sense of the distinctiveness of Black studies is central to those PhDs, to those educations, to those to the both the creation and contribution of the institutionalization of the field. And so, standardization and what is Black studies, I think that I love this as a question, and but it is also one of these questions that because it ought to really touch at like the heart of what everybody does. I mean, my PhD is in philosophy, and I always say that the only real philosophical question, I mean, it's a cliche of philosophy, that the only real philosophical question is what is philosophy? And that's amazing, but we're also talking about, 3,000 years
Yeah.
in the Western Academy of that being a permissible question. It's a weird moment to be asking what is Black studies as a constitutive Black studies question. I love that, but it's also one of these moments where, because everything's both precarious and new at the same time, makes it I just think a more fraught, like, issue to take up. But it
Absolutely.
being fraught is not a negative thing for me, but it's also fraught.
I really appreciate David Marriott, and I think the very beginning, maybe like the foreword or preface of Whither Fanon, um, where he says, or maybe it's of effacement, I'm not sure, but he says blackness becomes like philosophy in this kind of like ongoing and like unsettled questioning about what it is, like what is blackness, what is being, and and philosophy and blackness as these kinds of modes or contexts of questioning that kind of allow you to, think anew about whatever these things might mean over the course of 3,000 years or, 400. So, yeah, I've felt really emboldened, I guess you could say, to figure out what that means so long as I am in an African American Studies department. I last year was on the market and was a finalist, gave a job talk at a public policy undergrad college, basically, and their political theory track. And I was like, this is random, but okay. So I went out and I made this job talk, and I think that interestingly enough, I don't know if you ever heard this, but I've heard that Afro-pessimism is not actually of Black studies. Like, it's a kind of thing written by people outside of Black studies. And I never really felt that until I gave the job talk at this place where, because, I would have been the only Black person in this department, my job talk was structured as a kind of more traditional engagement with and critique of, things in Western political philosophy. I think it was about Hobbes and sovereignty or something. It was good. I mean, I didn't get the job, so maybe it wasn't perfect, but,
That never
um,
means anything.
you know,
Yeah.
but now being in, Illinois, Department of African American Studies, the job talk that I gave here, or the lecture that I gave here, I guess, was a result of a lot of kind of early research that I'm, completing right now for my book project. And the talk that I gave was basically, I think it was called "The Dark Thread of Violence in the Ontology: King and the Ontology of Black Political Action," and it happened because when I got here, I'm brainstorming the book. I'm like, okay, Kevin, you have escaped your PhD somehow without doing any kind of canonical work. You know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Like, you read my dissertation and you'll be like, so I'm definitely trying to publish before that thing's out from embargo, right? So I'm like, the book's got to do some of that work. And up until that point, the dissertation and my work had been a lot about, contemporary protests, 2020 Minneapolis, the kind of scene of the riot or the uprising therein. And so it seemed apparent to me that I would need to have something to say or some relationship to the kind of larger inheritance and history of nonviolent political action and direct action in Black political life. And so I was like, I should go read King. And I thought it would be this engagement where, you know, it made sense to me why people put him in a kind of more normative understanding of Western political philosophies, understanding of civil disobedience and, kind of like liberties and things like that. Uh, from
I didn't
who,
know the West had an idea of civil disobedience, but
yeah,
but, I
was that
mean,
sarcasm? Is that sarcasm?
I mean, I think of the West as, at most, they have some dissidents of, recent dissidents around, civil disobedience, but, this is where I was as a scholar of anti-colonial struggle, I'm always like, yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. No, I
No, no,
mean,
I'm thinking, like, I think of King so much as inventing this kinda moment,
I
certainly
would I would say at least that I think what King invents is not as reducible to Henry David Thoreau or Mahatma Gandhi
yeah,
or Theory of Justice guy. What is his name?
Rawls.
Rawls, right, right. So that was where I
Thank
thought
you for
that.
not I am so sick of Rawls, I'm so glad you're like, "What's that guy?"
No, yeah, 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 yeah. uh, and so I started reading all those people, Hannah Arendt, all of the things that they were saying about disobedience, nonviolence.
Mhm.
Judith Butler, which was also, uh, and then I read King, and then I started reading King. I picked up his books, right? Basically everything he written in like the last 10 years of his life. I think it's like 3 or 4 books. Like Why We Can't Wait, Where We Go From Here. And a few speeches, like those 2 books, like a few speeches from the last 10 years of
Mhm.
his life. And I was so struck by even as he was developing his philosophy of nonviolence, his justification, his kind of like telos across those writings, it did not seem to me that the, invention or not invention, but like the development of nonviolence was primarily concerned with white people. When I read King, I saw him
Mhm.
profoundly concerned with the transformation and the self-understanding of Black people, right? And
Absolutely.
what was very interesting though was that if you go back and you read all of those things, the way that he orients the kind of like urgency, possibility of what you're moving to and also what you're moving away from by practicing nonviolence, he talks about the 1958 assassination attempt against his life by Zola Curry, Black woman diagnosed with schizophrenia who stabbed him with a letter opener at a book signing in Harlem. And over and over again, he comes back to this scene as both an analogy for the kind of pressure and violence that Black people were under around this time and why nonviolence was the appropriate kind of solution to these things.
Mhm.
Um, but what's interesting to me is that there's these slippages between or not slippages. I guess the best way to frame it is that it becomes such that the attack is internalized and he is more concerned about his own restraint against something like that than about that violence coming in.
Mhm.
But in a way, the violence is already coming from inside because of both it's a Black woman that he's using to analogize this, and then also the way in which he like returns to it again and again to structure his like kind of larger argument about the philosophy of nonviolence. And he becomes grateful the last speech he gives like days before he dies. He references it a last time and says, I'm so grateful I didn't sneeze, because the doctor had said if he had sneezed in any period while that blade was lodged in his chest, it would have ruptured his aorta and he would have drowned and died in his own blood, right? And so over and over again, he's like, I'm so grateful that I didn't sneeze. And it's just so interesting to me that like this whole thing becomes about a kind of constitutional self-restraint
Mhm.
that I think that we inherit in how we think about the broad political possibility of Black political action, but then also the things that we should be wanting, the things that we should be um, desiring for or fighting against. I think these are a lot of our kind of more downstream and maybe material kind of ideas about what are the ends of Black politics, I think start here from this kind of idea
Mhm.
of self-restraint. But that something was not something that was apparent to me or something that I could access until I was doing the work in an African American Studies department. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the kind of, haunting question of the social life of social death was inaccessible until the Afro-pessimist got in the door and could think about it. You know what I'm saying? And I didn't think about that when I was writing it, but when I thought about the 2 job talks that I gave a year apart, the difference between being in a place where I'm the only Black person and being in the midst of a department of Black social life, you know what I'm saying? Like presented different kind of intellectual opportunities and avenues for me to follow. And so I don't remember how I started talking about this, but when I speak a little bit about the tensions or resistances in the fields and it frustrates me because I do think that agree or not, like our job is not to be agreeable. Our job is not to all be on the same page. Our
Mhm.
job is
Mhm.
to assess and evaluate a rigorous contribution to scholarship that we do not have to agree with or not, right? But I can only imagine, like, how many people, don't share that opinion, that where like this kinds of thinking can get shut down. So yeah, I don't remember what the question was, but
No, you've gotten. I mean, I appreciate your reflections here because they've gotten so deeply into these questions, that I had, which you've answered about, how Black study sensibilities shape how you read, how you
right.
think, how you research, but also where you think this research is opening up new horizons and also fitting into the past of Black studies. And, the example of King is so interesting to me because, King is, I think he's less canonical to Black studies than he should be. That's my own opinion. Because I don't
Depends
think
on which thing,
I
yes.
think he's someone people talk about, but they don't read. When you were like, I went ahead and read these books, I was like, that's such an odd thing to say at some level, but you could only kind of say it about King or maybe Malcolm X,
Mhm.
right? They're so iconic that we have so many thoughts about them. And then you read the books, you're like, huh. Whereas people don't have iconic thoughts about Du Bois. You got to go like read Black Reconstruction or Souls of
Mhm.
Black Folk.
Mhm.
So, but when you were talking about that, I thought like, this is this moment of being lodged very deeply in the tradition of Black studies and the Black
Right.
intellectual tradition, but also these critical frames that you're working with, opening up all these different horizons, but also that theoretical sensibility about thinking about self-formation,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
which is, I mean, you didn't put it this way, and maybe you disagree, but so every time I teach Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. together, this is one of the things I come back to as both unexpected, but also in entirely compelling companionship between them, which is this formation of the self and the discipline of the self, right? As a form of political agency, like whatever the political values that come out of that, that's such an important part of that moment, right? Of a
Yeah.
revolutionary moment. The civil rights movement was a revolutionary moment, whatever its
Yeah.
legacy has been. But that's also in the beginning of Souls of Black Folk, where Du Bois is going through in that first book about, all these different ways that the Black children react to the racism of their school and the racism of the playground, right? Some become, obsequious, some become depressed and despondent. He says, I'd made me just want to like score better on tests, run faster, and beat their stringy little heads. So that stringy heads. And, but that sense of like how self-formation happens as a theoretical question embedded in the canon of Black studies, but the way you were talking about it was, and brought it back to these questions of afropessimism that afropessimism puts so intimately to us, is also that way of opening up those questions to new horizons and seeing their import in new ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think the second half of that job talk was still reading King. The whole thing was about King, but it was less about the Curry part and more about the talk between him and Stokely Carmichael,
Mm-hmm.
where Carmichael's like, I was trying to, get the kind of, what is it, Black Power thing on the board. Um, I don't want to, say too much. You never know, but I don't want to say too much because eventually someone will read it. But this, uh, you talk about self formation, and there is a part of that for me. I think I like your reference to Du Bois, and I also think about, of course, Fanon in that sense. But what and to some extent, like I'm hearing what you said, and it's interesting. Sorry, I'm trying to shelve it in my
Hmm.
head as I'm saying it. It's processing. Anyway, the meeting between King and Carmichael in King's writing is so interesting to me because it doesn't strike me about being about like a kind of self formation. They argue between, being they're saying freedom now or saying black power, and they end up saying nothing. Like they just can't agree on anything. And so they're like, okay, we're going to go out here and march and we're not going to say anything. And I think that that's such an interesting moment because of how uh, this is actually a problem of language. Do you know what I'm
Mhm,
saying?
mhm.
And everything that, structural analysis of language from linguistics to anthropology to psychoanalysis, like, wants to encourage us to think about, I think that there's a relation that we inherit between the anxiety between freedom and Black power that is, you know, still, undefined, still something that, like, we need to work through as a field. Um, but I often think it is about this idea of self-fashioning and being able to say Black power or freedom now, for example, is a testament about the kind of self that you're making up in the world, right?
Yeah,
And I
absolutely,
do
I like
think
that.
that there is importantly a distance between those things
Mhm.
because I don't think that Blackness is reducible to those people made Black, right? Like blackened or Black people, right? And I think that's important to sit with because when we talk about what it is at stake in the field right now, what it is that is the field right now, right? Eventually we run up against a problem. Is our position here like the study of Blackness? Is it the study of people who are called Black or who know themselves as Black? Um, is there a relationship between these two things? Are one always reducible to the other? And of course, we say race is a social construction, yada, yada, yada. But it does often seem like there's a difficulty to take that intellectual distance from Blackness, which is a self and imposition, and stretch it out, think about it, break it open, blow it up without feeling like it is an attack on your own sense of self and your own kind of in conscious
Mhm.
integrity. You know what I'm saying? And this is the whole reason that, Afro-pessimism has had such bad rap in part, right? Jared Sexton talks about, I think, in that Affirmation in the Dark interview, where he's like, they say, "I'm not a slave, I'm a gainfully employed professor, da, 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 da." Like, there's this collapse between the structural analysis that the theoretical turn is something like Afro-pessimism is trying to name and how it makes one feel. And I just don't think that those two things need to be correlated in such strong ways and that, theory actually gives us tools to, like, ethically perform that distance.
Yeah.
Um, but to that point, right, I do think that sometimes our work in some places in the field can be overdetermined by an expectation of activism, or something that like needs to be put on the ground and read by like your organizing meeting tonight. And
Mhm.
um, I don't think that that should be the kind of hegemonic imperative of Black studies.
Yeah, thank you for all that. It's all super interesting, and maybe already, you've started to give a response to both of these last 2 questions I have for you, but, especially this first one. I wanted to ask you to reflect on the past and future of the field and ask, what do you think Black studies has historically done well, but what do you think also it has not done particularly well?
Yeah. What has Black studies done well? I mean, it's institutionalized well. Um, that might be a controversial claim, but I do think it has. Like, I'm at this university where, like, I mean, maybe don't include this part, but like the dean of the college is in my department. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Mhm.
there is a way in which there's been institutional achievement. We think about, yeah, I don't need to name names. There are many people who have started in AFAM departments who are now in university upper leadership,
Yeah.
and so I think that's important, right?
Mm.
Because right now, for example, colleges all over the country are like, Black studies, forget it, right? But our dean here is like, that is not happening under my watch, right? Like, I don't want to preside over my department being closed. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, one of
And
my deans is a former Black studies professor, and it
yeah,
makes a huge difference.
it does make a difference. And I think that that is important. I think the academy broadly is elitist and, has so many problems and that we can name all day. I think sometimes we get a little bit misdirected when we are angry at the institutionalization of Black studies, right? That was kind of the goal. And separate from that, Black studies is not separate from everything else that's happening in the world, right? And I think that we do need to think about some of our present challenges. One of my gripes, and I'll probably catch flack for this, but one of my gripes with a lot of like listening to historians give talks is I often find that they take a kind of like a tone of voice that is telling us something that perhaps we should have already known, and if we did, we would be acting better right now. And that is totally valid in so many for so many things, right? Like Black history, us quote unquote not knowing that history was one of the impetus or impeti, I don't know, for getting Black studies on the
Mhm.
stage, right? You know, like we need to know about our life and history. But sometimes I think we underestimate the unique parts of the kind of contemporary world we're living in, right? And one of those I think is the multiple things, but one of them is the transmission between academic knowledge production and people who care about what we're talking about in the academy. And the fact that, like, as soon as something is published and it happens to be open access online, a week later it could be circulating on Twitter. People could be like having debates about it. You know what I'm saying? On one hand, that's great, right? Like, there are people who care about what we're doing outside of here. But
Mhm.
on another, it is it's difficult because ideas develop and travel in the academy in a particular way, right? We publish something and it's not just like, here's the end all be all of this forever. It is a contribution to a larger kind of activity of knowledge production that gets
Mhm.
debated and contested by peers. And whatever lasts, longest, 20, 50, 60 years, whatever, these are the things we come to start taking as canonical as, approximating something like truth, right? But I don't think that people outside of the academy receive our work with that same context. And I think that is difficult at the same time that we're trying to do something like defend academic freedom or like tenure or something. And things are getting out of our work that people are like, how does this help my life? How does
Mhm.
this change what I'm doing? Like, why should I continue giving my tax dollars to you for that? Right. So on some hand, like that's a difficult thing. And I think one challenge that we could um imagine a better solution to is how to communicate, right? I think science has science communicators. I think that like Black studies should take its job as seriously as scientists and hire other people to communicate it.
I love that. Yeah.
I think that that
I
would be
think
a
we have
really,
bad representatives when it does go out,
in a
so
lot of ways. And I remember I was watching this show, I think it was called like College Hill or something, and basically like celebrities went to college. And like they were at an HBCU or some southern school, and they had an African American studies class, and they took us through like their business class or like chemistry class, and they did things. I was like, oh, they're going to African American studies classes. I'm so interested to see like what's going to be the representation of the field. It's like a 9-second clip, and it's a professor being like, "Be home before the street lights, what?" And then the class saying, like, "Turn on." And then, like, that's it. Like, that's the only
wow.
representation. I'm not saying that that is, the standard of representation for African American studies, but there is this idea that it is just a kind of, like, cultural home, a kind of historical, like, getting to know oneself, and that there is, like, nothing happening at the cutting edge in the field, right?
Yeah.
That might need translation, that might need professional communication to make any kind of, salience to people, but also to have a kind of stronger branded idea about what Black studies is out in the world, right? We're living in the aftermath of critical race theory becoming literally anything at this point, like, I think that we have to be I think it's maybe uncomfortable to think about what it means to like think of an offensive position in Black studies. I
Mhm.
started talking about this, but like I do think we need one, right? There is no justification for something like Black studies in the neoliberal university, not anymore. Um, and so like this idea that like the whole like liberal aspiration of knowledge, that's not gonna cut it. I don't know what will cut it, right? But I do know that, communicating more very like exciting kinds of collaborations.
Hmm.
I, I don't know, like if you're one building away from behavioral psychologists and mechanical engineers, they're not thinking about you and like what kind of collaborations y'all could be doing. But you're in your office thinking about, well, if these people just knew this, maybe they would listen to me. What would it be like if you just walked over the quad and like was like, hey, can we go get some tea? Like, you don't know me, but like help me think about what this thing is. You know what I'm saying? Just like much, much broader, bigger thinking, I think, is necessary. That is about like a strong idea. People will be like, why would you major in African American studies 4 times? Right. But they would never ask a chemist that. Like, there's not the same idea that like there is something worth specializing in Black studies over
Yeah.
15 years for, So I don't know. I get hyped up about that, but I just guess we should just dream bigger, like punch bigger, shoot for the stars, land them on the clouds type thing. So, but that's also what being in 4 African American studies departments over the last 15 years is kind of giving me too. It's just
Hmm.
like this daringness to continue to like carve out uh a unique understanding of the intellectual project that I'm about. It's wild to me that I made it out without being disciplined into, one thing or another, but now that I have, I'm gonna use it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe somebody could start a Black Studies podcast.
No, like
Get some
like
content.
this is great.
I know, I'm
No,
just joking.
I'm super excited
But I agree. I like the
yeah.
spokesperson. We need better spokespeople. I think it's often we don't get the best representation. This College Hill example I have not seen, but it's really made me a little bit sick. I both love and hate that you told me that.
Yeah, no, it's bad, man.
Well, let me ask you a last question, and maybe you just actually gave an answer to it. Last question to wrap up, which is, thinking in a Black Studies context, what's the question you would want us to be asking, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Mm. I think that there is some kind of consensus. I don't know if I agree with it or not, but I do think that there's a little bit of a consensus that um some things went left with identity politics, so called, and kind of similar to this thing that I was just saying, where Black studies is kind of just reduced to knowledge and history about Black people in a historical or sociological sense. I do think that it is worth, again, developing a kind of, I don't know, understanding of Blackness that's not reducible to that in those ways, right? And I mean, I don't know, like it wasn't even an Afro-pessimist who said this. It was Fred Moten, right? But Blackness does not belong in Black people, right? But there is kind of like a, you know, privileged or underprivileged relationship to it, depending on how you want to see. So it's not to say that we aren't the ones who, should be talking about this or anything like that. But as an intellectual project, which will make for a kind of liability that opens up, different challenges about perhaps the kind of disentangling, at least intellectually, between what we mean when we say Blackness and Black people, right? But I do think that one of the things that Afro-pessimism has been really helpful for me to, in my own thinking, is helping me separate those things, right? I think a lot of people get caught up in Afro-pessimism's strong polemical claims that like the Black is the slave, But again, if you take seriously their kind of psychoanalytic engagement, you understand the kind of like grammar or structure of language itself is the thing that they're trying to get at, think about, or get after, right? I read the blurb of the back of your book at the limits of nihilism or something like that, at the margins of nihilism, and you talk about Afro-pessimism as a closed system. And I thought that was very interesting because, one, I don't know that anything achieves the closure it desires, right? Even if that closure is a kind of like rebellious desire. And at the same time, I never read Afro-pessimism as telling me that I was a slave or that I could never do anything or that, like these But the kinds of anxieties that I felt, or the kind of anxieties that I felt other people emanate from Black people or Black ideas, right? That to me is the closed system. Like, to me, it was just apparent that, like, the kind of structure of language is itself anti-Black, but it was not, to me, this idea that all thinking, all kinds of beings that we might imagine, or all horizons for political possibility is foreclosed upon. And that to me is not just from reading Afro-pessimism, but it's also from reading Sexton and De Silva in their kind of like cosmic and quantum terms, you know what I'm saying? Like, really just going as big as possible to be like, all of the matter and energy that has ever existed in this universe still exists now and it's gonna exist. Like, there's not gonna be any more, any less of it. And to that, I really drew it back down in, right? And was like, sure, this might be a closed system. And I might be ready to like wash my hands of it. That does not itself mean that all other systems are completely beyond us forever and ever, right? Like, everything is just kind of like a reorganization of the alphabet at the end of the day, until we find a different way of communicating that is not perhaps language based. But the point still stands, you know, like, no one has the possibility to say all hope is lost or all hope is this way. And neither should most professors be pontificating about these things, right? A lot of these people, you know, are, you know, middle class or upper middle class, tenure professors who haven't worried about health insurance or losing their job in a long time, you know? And I feel like that's okay. You know, do the work that you can do as someone who's not thinking about those things, and both like not carry the, like, there's so much that goes into this, right? Not carry the guilt that your grandma needs to be able to read your dissertation, or it needs to matter to somebody who can't eat tomorrow, right? Like, the academy is fucked, and these are not things you're going to solve with your book. And so I think it is worthwhile to like not hold on so tightly to this thing that has organized us. And any conversation about, you know, the otherwise and the future and the marronage or the fugitive that folks love to have and launch against Afro-pessimism, or see Afro-pessimism as a foreclosure of those things, right? It opens them for me. I don't know, man. It just does. At the end of the article that I just wrote, what does Black protest appear to be? Like, I spend this whole article just like going through the kind of like the abolitionist democratic frame of visual political possibility. And then I get down to the end, and that part of the article came much later, where I remembered from my organizing days the mandate for Black people that Mary Hooks had kind of invented. I loved that because nowhere in there was there this kind of defeated idea or something not being possible. But at the same time, there was not this focus on success or any of the trappings of kind of political coherence or legibility or desire that we tend to associate with, you know, political speech. And that to me was what was very interesting, because again, the whole kind of point of my project, like Black protest at the limits of the political, is that there is something, call it a Black epistemology, a way of being, a way of knowing, right, that wants out of all of this, and that is not satisfied with a democracy that finally includes my Black face in it, right? But that to me is the direction for any new kind of living whatsoever, because it does seem that so much of our language, our political desire, our political identities, our political strategies for effecting transformation have been, you know, exhausted by the kind of hyper acceleration of capitalism and technology over the last, you know, 50 to 80 years. I think we often critique this idea that we live at the end of history, but so many people are still acting as if we're living at the end of history. And I just want to refuse that and keep thinking. So that's what I'm doing.
I love that. Thank you. It's a great place to wrap up. And I like that as an imperative, you know, keep thinking and what that means, and both what are some of the imperatives built into that, ethical, political, epistemological, but also the freedom that you've really insisted on throughout this, which I appreciate so much. I'm so happy we had time to talk, Kevin. This is a fantastic contribution to the series, and I think so much of what you've said here really make sure that we think about critical theory as central to Black studies. And
Definitely.
as a fellow critical theorist, I have a little bit extra appreciation for that. So I just wanted to note that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
No problem. It's been a great time. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Take care.
See you.